Yeah, sure. So the question we're recording here. So the question was, um, first year med student. I talked briefly about not matching and that, but how do you deal with the challenges and the setbacks? Otherwise, in other aspects of medicine, and keeping from blaming God, and how do you move forward with those struggles? That's a great question. I think generally speaking, in medical school, there are some things that you just get, which are great. You just understand. You do well, and you understand. There's some things that are a lot more challenging, and like I mentioned, like the whole kidney function and all that for me. I think there's a couple things from a practical perspective. You have to realize you have to kind of look at things from a big perspective, in that a lot of times in ourselves we tend to be, especially at an environment like Brown, we tend to be kind of perfectionists. Or we try to be very, we think highly of ourselves, and because we're bright, we're here. You guys are in the Ivy League and all that. But you have to understand that medicine is a very big universe, and there's a lot of things that, like I said before, there's some things you can get, but there's some things that do take time, and you'll notice with, just practically speaking, from medicine, you'll see things over and over again. So you may not get it the first time, but then subsequently you can, things do eventually filter in. Like, for example, my worst subjects, I think, in medical school was pulmonology, and which is the study of the lungs, and also we had like a pharmacology class. So just so many drugs to learn. It's like, honestly for me, it's like practically like, do I really have to learn all these medications? And in actuality, okay, when you're actually out in the real world, there aren't that many medications you have to know about. Right? Even if your family practice, or when I do anesthesia, there's really a set number of drugs that we see over and over again that we get very good at. You get very good at prescribing, or you're very good at injecting into people, which is what I do. And so for me at the time, it was like I was frustrated because it's like it's just rote memorization. It's very hard to when you're hearing of a generic name of a drug. How do you memorize that? You can do little creative things with the words and things like that to try and remember. But I think the challenge, and the funny thing is that anesthesia, the two most important things are drugs and lungs, because we ventilate them, and you have to make sure that they're lung functioning, and the heart as well. So I think it takes time, and I think there's a certain element of patience you need with yourself, especially since we're so driven. You think you have to get now, you have to get the right way, and there is that pressure because you have exams as well, and they want to test how well you know the material. But I'd say from the long view, you'll see it over and over again. You'll see it practically in the hospitals when people actually start giving medications. Like, okay, I learned this in class. We're actually giving it to this person in the hospital. The other, I think, answer to that is, I think, from a more biblical perspective, is what I'm going to talk about next. Actually, so this is a great segue. Okay, into our talk here. So I think there are three truths I think that we need to hang on to when it comes to who God is and how it can relate to who we are as believers. Whether when you're, like I said, in medical school or whatever, grad school or whatever you guys end up in. The first thing is God, and I'll talk a little bit about each. One is God's sovereignty, God's grace, and God's glory. Okay, these three things. I think you've heard of these terms, no doubt, but I think we need to really kind of drill in to how this relates to you guys, specifically as students. So let's talk about God's sovereignty. So, you kind of know what that means. God's Lord over all things. John 5:17. He's referring to the Sabbath. Jesus is referring to the Sabbath in this case, but he's saying, "My Father is at work to this very day, and I too am working." That I think when we understand that God is sovereign over all things, which includes the particular specialty we end up in, the patients we take care of, the people that we take care of, even their outcomes. Only then can we really stop fretting and trying to control our own destinies. Okay, because they're in the hands of a very loving and very smart God. Okay, and something that I don't think we realize sometimes. So, for example, when you congratulate a fellow med student on their successful exam, despite you not being so successful. Or when you go when you go to bed after a long day of studying, and there's still more to study, but in your heart, you're echoing David's words in Psalm 4:8, which says, "I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." Like those ideas that's when you're resting in the sovereignty of God, because you're trusting that He really is in control of all these things. Okay, even like I said, when you may not do well, as well as you hope, as you think. So I said this. Then dwell upon how resting in the absolute unshakable sovereignty of God can provide confident and peaceful assurance in which you can hope. Right. So I'm not saying everything goes well. Like it's easy to rest in the sovereignty of God when things are going well. Right. I'm talking about when things don't go well, and when you guys do struggle, and so if you don't do well in class, or you get a bad evaluation, or these attendings or these people who are evaluating us become like gods to us, do we really believe that their decisions will ultimately determine our destinies, right? I think that's kind of the question. So it's how we respond in crisis situation that reveal where our hope is, right? And who we really trust. And so, for example, I'll give you an example that my OBGYN experience on my night rotation. I look back on it years later. I find it humorous that my initial reason for staying for morning report was this eager yet prideful desire to go the extra mile. So other people take notice. Maybe be impressed. Like, oh, he could go home, but he's staying to learn more. And I knew it was prideful because at the time I went from enjoyable learning experience to like medical student horror story. So that sort of visceral response was to my attending just welled up from like this self-righteous anger. It didn't really reflect my calling, right, as a medical student to walk in humility. So I think a couple things to take note. Okay, whatever you guys have to struggle with, he's not caught by surprise by what just happened. All right, he knows what happened. In fact, you could argue he ordained it, and that's a hard saying for some people because we tend to think God ordains the good things, but then if we truly believe in the sovereignty of God, sometimes it's the challenging things that we may not see the clear picture of why this is happening to us. Okay, so understand Jesus is with you. Okay, in that experience, he understands the multitude of emotions that you might be feeling. They can't put into words. I know some people are just so frustrated or angry they can't really think. Jesus is there with you. He knows that. He knows what you're going through. You need to trust him, right, with your circumstances, even though you might not know the particular reason why you're going through that suffering. And not only is he with you, but he's sovereignly powerful to guide and protect you through that time. Okay, so there's as a lot of us are Brown students. So as a Brown student, there's one guy ahead of you guys who experienced very similar things. I don't know if you guys recognize this person. I got this from the Brown Digital Library. He said this, and I'll tell you who this guy is in a second. He said, "If I had not felt certain that every additional trial was ordered by infinite love and mercy, I could not have survived my accumulated sufferings." This was Adoniram Judson. Okay, I don't know if he was actually a missionary to Burma in the 1800s. He, at the time, it was not called Brown, it was called College of Rhode Island Province Plantations. He was class of, I think, 1807. So he was 16 when he went to Brown, what we now call Brown. That was in 1804. He graduated valedictorian when he was 19. And he was the first Protestant missionary sent from North America to reach in Burma. So kind of so you guys have someone ahead of you that's already trusting in the sovereignty of God who's from Brown University. Okay, so you can sort of just realize that there's precedent. So in other words, basically what's saying, his suffering was meaningful and it was worth struggling through because it was ordained by a sovereign and loving God. Okay. Another way to put it, Helen Keller, you might have heard this quote. Helen Keller was asked, is there anything worse than being blind? And she said yes, having sight but no vision. So we need to have this eternal-minded vision of the sovereignty of God so we don't get caught up into this sort of embittered mindset that a lot of doctors and students can get into. Okay, so that's the first sort of characteristic of God. The other characteristic is God's grace, the second thing. So I like to sort of label as another way to describe it is unmerited favor, unmerited love, and really God's grace has permeated history from the beginning of time, even from Genesis all the way through when we talk through the New Testament. So for the sake of time, I just want to talk I'll just talk to you about Ephesians. Because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved, right? In Romans, but God demonstrates his own love for us. In this, while we were sinners, Christ died for us, right? So, what does this mean? So the truths from his word, when we're talking about God's grace, we can understand intellectually, right? It's a reminder that God's love for us is not dependent on how we might perform academically, right? Or how intellectually astute we might appear before others, right? And I have to admit, there are many times I felt like a failure, in front of my classmates, just because they were able to get it. They understood these concepts and whatnot, or intimidated by my classmates' success. But we need to remember that Christ willingly still died for me and you, even when we were in our sins, and it's not dependent on our works. We have to keep reminding ourselves that, because it's a gift, right? No matter what you've done, God's love for you is there, and so practically speaking, what does this mean when you're floundering in class? What does God's grace have to do with anything about me failing or struggling or not doing as well as I hoped? And this is kind of what I want you guys to really kind of think through and just really be able to chew on and internalize for yourselves. I say this: God's grace gives us hope when we're struggling, okay? Because we know that through such struggles, God's creating in us this holy perseverance and a character, to display his glory. His grace lets us understand when we're trying to that when we're struggling to understand concepts like cardiac anomalies, or I mentioned this, like pediatric diseases, he's still very gracious. He's still very patient with us, right? And even when we're impatient with ourselves, he teaches us how to worship and know this God of intricate complexity, while at the same time acknowledge he's also our great teacher, right? He's not some graying grandfather that's slowly becoming demented, right? He created this stuff that we're trying to learn. How about on the flip side? We're doing really well. We remember. I just want to point you to Romans 8:32, which is, remember that any blessing we receive comes from the Father, right, who gives us His Son and who's graciously gives us all things. So in other words, He's imbued you with the talents. He's given you the gifts. And I just remember. I think I watched a YouTube video of Jeremy Lin, when the basketball player who went to Harvard, and when he gives his testimony, he's just it's actually very encouraging, because he realizes he's a talented guy, but he gives all his glory to God, because he realizes all the talents, all the gifts have been given to him by the Father. Okay. How about, and you might notice this if you're in, I guess I've heard this heard over other places, like once you're in medical school, like within the first 6 months, you kind of know who you want not to treat you. Because either because of ethics, they're kind of like ethically kind of questionable, or there's some people that are just really competitive and they just isolate themselves from everyone else. How can we give them God's grace? And we know that, again, going back to Romans, because God, died for us even though we were sinners, we're all sinners, and there are people who just truly are, maybe for whatever reason are a lot more competitive, a little harder to get to know. We can still love them because we know that God loved us, even when we were maybe not the most easy to get along with. So in terms of just being able to relate to other people, even those who tend to isolate themselves. Okay, so that's God's grace. So we talked about God's sovereignty, God's grace, and the last part I want to talk about is God's glory. Why, if basic things can be done, like eat and drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God, right? Why not studying? If we can glorify God in our eating and our drinking, like surely we can glorify God in our studying, right? And knowing that we live and breathe and exist, for His glory, reminds us that our studies, our profession, our lives ultimately are made to make His name great. Okay, so you may have heard this. People say, just be a nice person, study hard. This time it's all about you guys. You may not have heard that last phrase so much, but it's sort of just kind of implied, like, you guys are medical students, or you guys are grad students, or you guys are, even now, you guys are students of Brown. Just be nice, do the best you can. It's all about you. But I want to submit this to you, that if you work hard or you're trying to be kind or competent for your own sake, that's an exercise in self-glorification, right? It's an exercise in giving yourself the glory and not God. And so I like C.S. Lewis. He says this. This is, I think, from his book Mere Christianity. If you're a nice person, you may have heard this before. I think it's worth reading. Again, if you're a nice person, if virtue comes easily to you, beware. Much is expected from those to whom much is given. If you mistake for your own merits what are really God's gifts to you through nature, and if you are contented with simply being nice, you're still a rebel. And all those gifts will only make your fall more terrible, your corruption more complicated, your bad example more disastrous. The devil was an archangel once. His natural gifts were far above yours, as yours are above those of a chimpanzee. Okay, so he basically saying that as much as you might want to convince yourself that all your talents, all your abilities, being a nice person, or just being, you have lots of gifts, he's saying, so did the devil, right? And he's living for himself. So simply put, it's rebellious idolatry. And it sounds kind of hard, but I think we have to realize this truth that everything we do should be for God's glory. It shouldn't be for our own sort of building up of our own kingdoms. And I think we understand that, but in terms of practically speaking, we need to understand that this is, even studying is something that's important, that we need to give God glory to. So let your accomplishments, let your experiences be done for the purpose of reflecting any glory you might receive back to God. Right? Acknowledge that all the work you do is for His glory and in His strength and for His sake. So basically in a nutshell, what does that mean? We need to magnify God. We need to honor God. And so, sort of give you an example. I think John Piper sort of describes it well. Do you guys know where this is by any chance? If you're from California, okay. Yes. No. Okay. So this is Yosemite. Okay, so this place called Tunnel View is right where there's a long tunnel where you go out into Yosemite, and then you look over on your left, and you get this beautiful view. And Fresno's only an hour away, so that's my plug for coming to Fresno if you guys want to visit Yosemite. Half Dome, you guys might have heard that. It's kind of behind these clouds over there. But anyway, so John Piper sort of describes magnifying God. Imagine, he says, imagine you're looking through a telescope into the vast night sky, and you're making that which appear small begin to appear as big as it really is. Okay, so for example, to the naked eye, Jupiter is just a small blip in the sky, but if you look through a telescope, you begin to understand its true size. It's like 1,400 times the volume of Earth, and so in the same way, when we magnify God, we need to show others and ourselves, who may think little of God, how big He really is. Okay, so. These are just a couple of pictures I just wanted to throw in there too. This is in Alaska. Actually, a couple of years ago, we went to Fairbanks, which is sort of in the middle part of Alaska, and we wanted to go see my wife and I went with some friends. We went to see the Aurora Borealis, right? So just some really nice pictures. And the person who took this picture we're good friends with, so this is probably my favorite picture. But we see God's glory and God's majesty in this. And to be honest, a camera actually picks up more light than in real life, because when you're looking at it with the naked eye, it's actually a little more faint than that. But when you use a camera, you can set the setting a little bit longer so it absorbs more light. But anyway, that's kind of what we see. So when we see the glory of God in creation, and then we think about a telescope, I think John Piper says this: the whole duty of the Christian can be summed up in this: feel, think, and act in a way that will make God look as great as He really is. Right? Be a telescope for the world of the infinite starry wealth of the glory of God. So just when we need to ask God to give us a vision of His wisdom and His power and His goodness, even in our studies, right, so that we can magnify Him throughout our life. So to imagine that telescope analogy, I thought that was really good. So that's actually all I have for this second part here. So again, just to recap, God's sovereignty, He's in control of all things, even the hard things, even our failures, even our struggles. And if we don't understand that and grasp that and know that He's good and that He still wants us to trust Him and follow Him, then it's very easy for us to just walk away. Because God, I tried to follow You. I didn't get what I wanted. I didn't get this specialty. I didn't become a dermatologist, or I didn't become this whatever, well-known, person, I didn't discover the cure to, cancer or whatnot. We need to trust in the sovereignty of God. And God's grace, as I mentioned before, it empowers us. It lets us realize that our self-worth, again, is not dependent upon how well we do, and God's glory. That's the reason why we live, why we study. Okay, so let's break up into groups again. Maybe some questions to help you guys kind of process things. Well, let's do it for like maybe 10, 15 minutes, just like we did last time. And then last one, our next sort of my little talk will be on ministry, kind of your own personal growth, things to do, and also with fellowship, and maybe I'll briefly touch on patience, because I don't think anyone here is quite there yet. I'll mention it briefly, and then also just the concept of success and what we can do, or how we should view that as. Okay, so break up, and I'll give you guys like a 5-minute warning, and then we'll resume.